She wore black turtlenecks, mimicking Steve Jobs. She had a boardroom filled with former cabinet secretaries and generals, people who'd shaped American policy for decades. She graced the cover of Fortune, Forbes, and Inc. magazine, called the next Steve Jobs, the youngest self-made female billionaire in America. Her company was valued at $9 billion. And then, in less than 2 years, it all disappeared. Not because of market conditions, not because of competition, but because the technology at the heart of her company never actually worked. This is the story of Theranos, one of the most spectacular frauds in Silicon Valley history, and what it teaches us about the dangerous intersection of ambition, deception, and the willingness to believe in miracles. In 2003, a 19-year-old Stanford student named Elizabeth Holmes dropped out of college with what she claimed was a revolutionary idea. She wanted to change healthcare, to make blood testing accessible, affordable, and painless. Instead of vials of blood drawn from your arm, she promised a few drops from a finger prick, tested on a device small enough to fit on a countertop, delivering results in hours instead of days. It was a beautiful vision, one that attracted hundreds of millions in investment, partnerships with major pharmacy chains, and a valuation that made Holmes a billionaire on paper. But there was one problem: the technology didn't work. And when that truth finally emerged, it didn't just destroy a company, it resulted in federal charges, a criminal trial, and a prison sentence for Holmes herself. This is the anatomy of a fraud, and the warning signs we all missed. Elizabeth Holmes was brilliant, at least on paper. She enrolled at Stanford at 18, studying chemical engineering, with an intensity that impressed her professors. But she was also deeply affected by a family history. Her great-great-grandfather had founded Fleischmann's Yeast, a successful company, and Holmes grew up hearing stories about entrepreneurship and legacy. In 2003, she approached one of her professors, Channing Robertson, with an idea. What if you could test blood, using just a few drops, eliminating the need for needles, making testing accessible to anyone, anywhere? It was compelling, especially because Holmes sold it with an origin story. She claimed to be afraid of needles herself, making this deeply personal. Robertson was convinced, and with his support, Holmes dropped out of Stanford, using her tuition money as seed funding for a company she called Theranos, a combination of therapy and diagnosis. She was 19 years old. Silicon Valley loves a certain kind of founder, young, visionary, willing to challenge conventional wisdom. And Holmes fit that archetype perfectly. She dressed like Steve Jobs, black turtleneck, every single day, cultivated an unusually deep voice, and spoke about Theranos with messianic conviction. She told investors this wasn't just a business, it was a mission: to democratize healthcare, to save lives, to change the world. And in Silicon Valley, that narrative is intoxicating. Theranos operated in stealth mode for years, refusing to publish scientific papers, refusing to open its labs to scrutiny, claiming trade secrets were too valuable to share. And rather than raising red flags, this secrecy made the company more desirable, more mysterious, more like the next Apple. The investors who poured money into Theranos weren't typical venture capitalists, they weren't healthcare experts, they weren't scientists. They were people like Rupert Murdoch, the media mogul who invested $125 million, the Walton family, heirs to the Walmart fortune, and Betsy DeVos, who would later become Secretary of Education. Theranos also assembled a board that read like a who's who of American power. George Shultz, former Secretary of State. Henry Kissinger, another former Secretary of State. James Mattis, a Marine Corps general who would become Secretary of Defense. William Perry, former Secretary of Defense. These weren't healthcare experts, they were geopolitical heavyweights. And their presence sent a message: if people this important believed in Theranos, it must be real. By 2013, Theranos began stepping into the spotlight. Holmes appeared on magazine covers, gave TED Talks, was profiled in The New Yorker, and cultivated comparisons to Steve Jobs at every opportunity. In 2014, she was named to the Forbes 400. With a net worth of $4.5 billion, the youngest self-made female billionaire in American history. The media coverage was breathless, fawning, almost religious in its reverence. Holmes was treated not as a CEO, but as a prophet, someone who would fundamentally transform an entire industry. Except, the technology still didn't work. Theranos claimed its proprietary device, called the Edison, could run hundreds of tests, using just a few drops of blood from a finger prick, delivering results faster and cheaper than traditional labs. If true, this would have been revolutionary. Traditional blood tests require venous draws, tubes of blood, sent to centralized labs, often taking days for results. Holmes promised to do all of this, with a device the size of a desktop printer, in pharmacies, in people's homes, accessible to everyone. And on paper, it sounded incredible. But in practice, it was scientifically implausible, for reasons that actual experts understood immediately. Blood testing isn't just about detecting substances, it's about detecting them accurately, at the right concentrations, without interference from other compounds. The smaller your blood sample, the harder this becomes. A finger prick produces tiny amounts of blood, often mixed with interstitial fluid, making accurate testing exponentially more difficult. Theranos claimed to solve this, but never published peer-reviewed research, never opened its labs to independent verification, never demonstrated the technology publicly. When scientists and lab directors asked questions, Theranos deflected, citing proprietary technology, trade secrets, competitive advantages. But science doesn't work on faith, it works on evidence. And the evidence, when it finally emerged, showed the Edison didn't work as advertised. Inside Theranos labs, according to whistleblowers and later court testimony, the reality was far different from the public narrative. The Edison devices were unreliable, producing wildly inconsistent results, failing quality control checks, unable to run most of the tests Theranos claimed. So employees allegedly did something quietly devastating: they ran the majority of patient tests on traditional blood testing machines, made by companies like Siemens. They diluted the tiny finger prick samples to create enough volume for these conventional machines, introducing additional errors and inaccuracies. In other words, Theranos wasn't revolutionizing blood testing, it was just doing traditional testing poorly, while telling patients and doctors the results came from its proprietary technology. This wasn't innovation, it was deception. By 2014, people inside Theranos began to realize something was terribly wrong. Tyler Schultz, grandson of board member George Schultz, was a Theranos employee who noticed the inaccuracies, the quality control failures, the gap between what the company claimed and what actually happened. He raised concerns internally, and was shut down. Erica Chung, another employee, saw similar problems: test results that were dangerously inaccurate, patients potentially receiving false diagnoses. Both Schultz and Chung eventually left the company, and began reaching out to regulators and journalists, risking their careers and facing legal threats from Theranos. They knew what they saw, and they knew people could be harmed. In October 2015, Wall Street Journal reporter John Carrera published an investigation that would change everything. Carrera had been tipped off by whistleblowers, and spent months verifying their claims, speaking to former employees, reviewing documents, talking to lab experts. His article alleged that Theranos was running most tests on traditional machines, that the Edison technology didn't work, and that patients were receiving inaccurate results. Theranos immediately went on the offensive. Elizabeth Holmes appeared on CNBC, called the article false, attacked Carrera's credibility, and mobilized her board members to defend the company. But Carrera kept publishing, article after article, each one more damning than the last. And slowly, the narrative began to shift. By early 2016, federal regulators could no longer ignore the allegations. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which oversees clinical labs, launched an investigation and found serious deficiencies at Theranos facilities. The findings were devastating: tests were inaccurate, quality control was inadequate, patient safety was at risk. In July 2016, CMS banned Elizabeth Holmes from owning or operating a clinical lab for 2 years. Theranos also faced sanctions from the FDA, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and state regulators in Arizona, where the company had partnered with Walgreens to offer testing in pharmacy locations. One by one, those partnerships collapsed. Walgreens terminated its agreement. Safeway ended its relationship. Investors began demanding their money back. In June 2018, federal prosecutors took the next step. They filed criminal charges. Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos president Ramesh Sunny Balwani were indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The indictment alleged they knowingly deceived investors, doctors, and patients, making false claims about Theranos technology, inflating the company's financial performance, and putting patients at risk. If convicted, they faced up to 20 years in prison. This wasn't just a civil matter anymore. It wasn't just about money, it was about criminal deception. Elizabeth Holmes' trial began in September 2021 and lasted for months. Prosecutors presented evidence of false statements to investors, manipulated demonstrations of the Edison device, and testimony from patients who received incorrect test results. Holmes took the stand in her own defense, claiming she believed the technology worked, that she relied on the advice of scientists and engineers, and that any failures were mistakes, not fraud. She also alleged abuse by Balwani, claiming he controlled her and influenced her decisions. In January 2022, the jury convicted Holmes on 4 counts of fraud against investors, while acquitting her on charges related to defrauding patients. In November 2022, she was sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. Balwani was tried separately, convicted on 12 counts, and sentenced to nearly 13 years. The Theranos story is ultimately about the gap between promise and reality, between what we want to believe and what actually exists. Elizabeth Holmes sold a vision that was emotionally compelling. Who wouldn't want blood testing to be easier, cheaper, more accessible? But wanting something to be true doesn't make it true. Silicon Valley has a culture that celebrates bold visions, that encourages founders to fake it till you make it, to move fast and break things. And sometimes that works, sometimes the technology catches up to the vision. But in healthcare, where accuracy matters, where lives are at stake, there's no room for faking it. Theranos wasn't developing a social media app. It was producing medical results that doctors used to make diagnoses. The gap between hype and reality wasn't just a business failure, it was potentially dangerous. One of the most shocking aspects of the Theranos story is how many smart people failed to ask basic questions. Investors poured in hundreds of millions, without seeing the technology, without demanding independent verification, without insisting on peer-reviewed research. Board members with impressive resumes joined without healthcare expertise, lending their credibility without understanding the science. Pharmacy chains partnered with Theranos, without requiring proof the tests were accurate. Why? Because everyone assumed someone else had done the due diligence. If George Shultz believed, if Rupert Murdoch invested, if Walgreens partnered, then it must be legitimate. But due diligence isn't about trusting credentials, it's about verifying claims, independently, rigorously, especially when stakes are high. Elizabeth Holmes cultivated a persona, the black turtleneck, the deep voice, the Steve Jobs comparisons, the messianic language about changing the world. And it worked. People were drawn to her, believed in her, wanted to be part of her story. This is the cult of personality, when a leader becomes more important than the facts, when questioning them feels like betrayal, when belief replaces evidence. Inside Theranos, employees who raised concerns were silenced, threatened with lawsuits, told they were betraying the mission. Tyler Shultz, the whistleblower, was estranged from his grandfather George Shultz, who chose to believe Elizabeth Holmes over his own grandson, at least initially. The cult of personality isn't just about charisma, it's about creating an environment where dissent is impossible, where loyalty is valued over truth. And in that environment, fraud can flourish, because no one is allowed to ask the hard questions. The Theranos story isn't just about one company, or one founder. It's about the systems that allowed this to happen, the investors who valued narrative over evidence, the media that celebrated without investigating, the culture that prioritizes confidence over competence. Elizabeth Holmes is in prison, serving 11 years, but the lessons of Theranos remain urgent. Because the next Theranos is already out there, another charismatic founder, another revolutionary promise, another company that may be built on hype rather than substance. So what do? We ask questions, even when it's uncomfortable, even when everyone else seems convinced. We demand evidence, peer-reviewed research, independent verification, transparency. We remember that credentials don't equal expertise, that a famous board doesn't validate technology, that belief is not a substitute for proof. And we recognize that in fields like healthcare, where the stakes are human lives, there's no room for pretending, no room for faking it, no room for hoping the technology will catch up to the promise. The Theranos story is a warning about what happens when we stop asking questions, when we choose to believe, because the alternative is too uncomfortable. Elizabeth Holmes promised to change the world, and in a way, she did. Just not the way she intended.